And this is actually, I'm rereading this book because I think it's the best book on mental training ever. It's called The Inner Game of Tennis. So the inner game of tennis basically is about self one versus self two. So every athlete, every person has two versions of themselves. So self one is that analytical side. So they think through things. If they're not making a shot, it's because their elbow's not in or they're not following through. They always think there's some sort of correction. So we can call that the conscious side. And then there's that self two, which is more of that subconscious side, where when you're in that zone, when you're in that flow and you're just killing and you have no idea what you're doing, that's self two. Obviously, the best athletes in the world are self two athletes. Also, why a lot of the best players in the world don't become great trainers, because a lot of times they're so self two that they have no idea what they're actually doing on the court. So I've talked to some of our players and I'll ask them questions like, hey, how do you do this? And they'll be like, I don't know. And that's the correct answer a lot of times for the best players, the best shooters. It's like, hey, man, what are you doing with your wrist? How are you following through? And they're like, I have no idea. I just shoot to make. Whereas the bad shooters are breaking it down to a science of exactly how they flick their wrist. So that's self one versus self two. Like a lot of these best players are just self two. Now, it's okay to be in tune with that self one and here and there make corrections. But too many athletes I see, you get carried away with that self one, always thinking that there's some sort of correction, and you take away from that self two, and we never become a killer. You got to understand, to be alive, just to breathe, you got to understand how many billions of things have to go right at the right time. Billions and billions of processes within the body are going right at the right times. To make a shot, to jump high, to do any athletic skill, do you understand how much has to go into that? Not only the billions of things at the cellular level, but the timing of the joints, the fluidity, the energy transfer, all of this stuff. This can only be controlled by self two. The only way that you can become a great, great shooter or jump really, really high is doing it at that subconscious level, because you cannot consciously control timing. That's one thing that you cannot do. Just like you can't wish yourself to being a good dancer. You can't just be like, you can't think through steps and then all of a sudden get that fluidity, right? That has to come from self too. So the point that I'm trying to make is, when we start becoming self one and we start making too many corrections, we are showing ourselves that we don't trust self two. We have a lack of trust in self two. And then self one starts to take over. Now fluidity is all killed. Timing is all killed. So anytime that I give you guys mechanics advice, shooting or jumping, whatever it is, you got to understand that we're trying to make a correction and then we're trying to get that back to self two. We're not saying that, hey, your self two sucks, so you need to become self one dominant. What we're saying is basically, I want you to make this correction. I want you to rep it out, and I want to get it to that subconscious so that we never have to think about this again. And you got to start to trust self two. So if you're in a shooting slump or you're not making shots one day, what do? We all go, oh, I know what I'm doing. I'm not tucking my elbow, or I'm not getting enough from my legs. We always think that there's some sort of mechanical correction, when a lot of the time it's just us being on that self one side, when we really need to just quiet that self one and trust self two. Have you ever been on fire? Have you ever had days where you made a lot of shots, where you were dominant, you couldn't miss? Then you have the ability to shoot. And on that day, you found self two. But on the other days, when you can't find that same zone, it's because you don't trust self two and you think that there's some sort of correction. So what hoopers do, and I do this myself, over the last 10 years, I've done this a lot with my shot. I'll come in, I'll start getting up shots, I miss, and then I'm like, I got to make a correction. I make that correction, and maybe it does start falling. And then I go, okay, that's my new shot. And it works for that day, and then I come back the next day, I try that again. Oh, it doesn't work. I got to make this correction. Then I make that correction. Sometimes it starts to go in, and then the next day I come in and that same thing doesn't work. And so you're in this constant cycle of changing your form. Or you find something on Instagram where a shooting coach is telling you to do something, and then you get away from who you are and you become who they want you to be. So basically what happens is you get in this cycle of there's always a correction, self one, when really you need to shut up and you need to trust self too. If you've ever made shots, if you've ever been on fire, you have the ability to shoot. You just got to get in that place mentally to then actually be able to do that consistently.